It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, God blasts Ghost, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Historical. Jesus on the planet. Matthew, Mark, Lucas, John.
Well, it's Robert M. Price, the Bible Geek, again, and I know you were hoping to be rid of me, but no such luck. I got a couple of announcements that you probably already heard if you're listening or you're reading the Bible Geek Facebook page or following my rantings on Facebook. But one of them is that the debate, I prefer to think of it as a dialogue between me and Bart Ehrman, will now be, it's scheduled, it will be the 21st of October next year, 2016. And I don't know where yet, but I'm sure that'll be worked out in plenty of time. Hope to see you there. Also, my book, Moses and Minimalism, is now available from Intellectual Press, and you can order it directly from them. Just look up Intellectual, like that's intellectual without the IN, intellectual.com, and you'll see it there. Eventually, I'll get some copies, and we'll have them available to buy right from me with an autograph, if you don't mind my defiling and defacing it. Years ago, I got a favorite author to autograph a copy of his first book, and afterward I thought, what the heck? Did he just scribble on it? His signature was illegible. Mine's not that great, but I'll try to do a little better than that. I've been very busy the past week working hard on the chapter on the Psalms in my book, Holy Fable, The Bible Undistorted by Faith. And I think it's really loads of fun, and you'll get a kick out of it. Still got some slogging to do in various parts of the Bible, but I'm almost seeing the light at the end of the Old Testament tunnel. I say almost because I still have the continent of the prophets to do. And as if that wouldn't have been difficult enough, with the minimalist approach that I'm taking, I have to wrangle with the question of what if these things are not actually collections of the oracles of prominent individuals like we usually picture Isaiah and Jeremiah and so forth. What if they're groups of poems written in these great names by unknown people, just like the apocalypses are? Got to do some thinking on that, and got to find some resources on that. Philip R. Davies suggests that, yeah, they may be written much later by other people, but in that case, why, and what are the various oracles really addressing? Oh boy, I won't burden you with it further. Anyhow, it's going pretty well. All right, here's the first one for today. Let's see, this is from Beloved Son of Rock, which I think has to do with being named Peterson or Paterson, I forget which. Do I understand your position correctly that the story in Genesis chapter 3 about the serpent and the eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil by the man and the woman is more about a conflict between two gods, Nehushtan and Yahweh, with Nehushtan winning? Well, sort of, kind of. Yeah, I think that underlying the story is a kind of, fait accompli, that Nehushtan, once part of the pantheon in the Jerusalem temple, was eventually kicked out during an attempt to well, basically streamline the pantheon into monotheism. This is usually called the Deuteronomic reform, or the reform of Josiah. In Holy Fable, I suggest that this happened much later, and that it actually happened in the 2nd century in Hasmonean times. But at any rate, the notion is that the worshippers of Nehushtan in the temple were the losers in this, and they had to in order to retain any sort of position in the hierarchical, no, that's not the word, the sacerdotal community, the priesthood, etc., they had to be demoted to Levites, which reflected their original allegiance to Leviathan, aka Nehushtan. And so they were like sub-priests, flunkies of various sorts, and so forth. Well, I think that the Eden story is a parallel to the Greek Prometheus story. And in that one, you also had a god who was no longer a god, Prometheus, one of the Titans. He was Zeus's cousin and a member of the previous dynasty of gods, aka the Titans. And he was on pretty good terms with Zeus, though he was sort of a pain in the rear and apparently cleverer than Zeus. And he aided the fledgling human beings that Zeus had created, whom he didn't care much about. And among other things, Prometheus saw to it, against Zeus's command, that humans learned how to make fire, and that sort of started civilization. And for this effrontery, he was condemned to be spread-eagled, some say crucified, on a huge boulder on Mount Etna, I think it was. And there a vulture would come every day to eat his liver. Well, it's a heck of a liver, right? How many days would it take? Well, it grew back miraculously every day, whether by the curse of Zeus or just because that's what happened. If you were a Titan, you were like the Wolverine and regenerated. I don't know, but it grew back every day. And the vulture came and ate it every day. Youch. No anesthetic, no doubt. Well, what's the deal here? I think that the Eden story is like that. The serpent is Nehushtan, or Leviathan, a divine serpent, just like Kingu and Apsu and Tiamat in Babylon and so forth. So he is actually, I think the story is written by a subordinated Nehushtan or Leviathan priest, a Levite, in other words, in the wake of the victory of Yahweh or Jehovah. And the way he wrote it, if you look close, the serpent is the hero and the benefactor of the human race, because Yahweh and his buddies, the we, the us that he mentions, he wanted to keep the tree of knowledge to himself. Apparently it had to do with procreation, and the gods procreated, but he didn't want humans to, because they didn't want any competition. He only created the one man in the beginning. That was enough to tend the garden, especially since he would have had access to the tree of life. He could have done what the gods do and continue to nourish and revitalize his immortality by eating it. The ambrosia of the gods, like in Greece. But he couldn't have knowledge of procreation and of eternal life, because that would mean you'd have a rival race of immortals. And so once, thanks to the intervention of the serpent, the man and the woman gain knowledge of procreation and of everything else implicitly. The worst has happened, exactly what Jehovah hoped would not happen, and he can't change it. It's too late. And so he kicks the man and the woman out of the garden before they can eat of the tree of life, which unfortunately they had so far neglected to do. And the man and the woman are punished, of course, but so is the serpent, just as Prometheus was. So yeah, this was the way his not defrocked exactly, but demoted priests could get their licks in. They couldn't deny that Jehovah was top of the heap. He had won, but they were going to make their God the hero, and did. So that is my belief about it. The Son of the Rock says, I also have an observation. For being fairly recently created, the man and the woman sure had a sophisticated language and knowledge for only having each other for conversational company. I mean, did the man dissect one of the animals to gain the knowledge to say, this is at last bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. This is to be called woman, for she was taken from man. Genesis 2:23, Jerusalem Bible. How else would he know what is inside the body? If this event actually happened, the man would most likely have said, bone from man, bone, bone, flesh from man, flesh, flesh, woman. And then the conversation between the serpent and the woman. The serpent, did God really say you were not to eat from any of the trees in the garden? Woman, not no, serpent tongue. Serpent, God say many day ago, no eat fruit from tree here. Woman, God say many day ago, no eat fruit from tree. Yes, eat fruit from tree here. Yes, eat fruit from tree there. Plurals, right? No eat fruit from tree there. No eat fruit, no touch fruit. Touch fruit, eat fruit, woman die. What die? Serpent, no woman die. God no. A woman eat fruit from tree there. Woman no. God no. Woman no good no. Woman no evil no. Thank you for listening, for clarifying your stand and listening to my crazy observation. Yeah, how did they know Hebrew in particular? Right, of course, it's, like it's just naive fairy tale kind of stuff. Jason from Charlotte. Let's see. While rereading the Old Testament, I stumbled across something odd. When reading about the descendants of Cain, I noticed a striking similarity to the descendants of his brother Seth. When compared side by side, the two lists were almost identical, with similar or identical names appearing in much the same order. Enoch versus Enosh, Mehujael versus Mahalalel, Methusael versus Methuselah, Lamech, same as Lamech. Are these actually supposed to be lists of descendants of two different people, or is this just another example of two versions of the same story, being told as if they were separate stories, as is so common in the Bible? Yeah, that's you're right. It's the J versus the P versions of this, and one of them doubles back and has all of the descendants just from Adam to Cain, etc. The other one, I'm sorry, the one just makes it a continuous link between Adam and the others. The other one doubles back and from Cain, and then hops back to Seth and continues through him. But there were two different versions, and they left them both in. Also, could you recommend a book or books on Canaanite mythology? I've always been fascinated by the pre-Hebrew mythologies that contributed to the world's most popular deity, but tracking down information on Canaanite polytheism has proven difficult. Any help would be greatly appreciated. In fact, any comparative work showing the relationship between Judaism and Babylonian, Akkadian, Sumerian, Zoroastrian, or any other mythology would be great. Well, I would recommend John Day, D-A-Y, Yahweh and the Gods of Canaan. I believe that is the correct title. There's a similar title by W.F. Albright, A-L-B-R-I-G-H-T. I would check that. But also, I think you'd really enjoy Hebrew Myths, the book of Genesis, by Robert Graves and Raphael Patai, P-A-T-A-I. That goes through story after story in Genesis with many, many parallels to these various stories and myths and names and so on. They're all fascinating reading. Okay, now this is from Derek Krupka, and he saith, I have some questions about Matthew and Mark. I can't tell if Matthew and Mark are actually in contrast with each other about the same event in the Gospels. In Matthew 8:14-15, we have Jesus going to Peter's house. He finds Peter's mother-in-law sick with a fever, and he touches her hand. The other example of a healing where Jesus touches the hand to heal in Matthew was with the ruler's daughter in chapter 9, verses 18-25. Is there another healing of the hand that you recall in Matthew? Now in Mark 1:29-31, we have Jesus in Peter's house taking her by the hand and lifting her up. I want to say there isn't a problem here, but I can't tell. Could you enlighten me? Let's see here. Lifting her up. Yeah, I think perhaps what you're thinking of is that in Luke, I think that he does not take her by the hand, and that in the theory I've read is that the fever is construed as a demon, and at least by Luke, who therefore doesn't want the person to be touched by the exorcist lest the demon switch over to him. But who knows? That it's hard to say. But there are changes. Usually Matthew changes Mark by way of abbreviation because he knows he's got a lot more non-Markan material, much of which he created, to put in his gospel. He uses a longer scroll, so do Luke and John. But even at that, there's so much more that he has to condense Mark. This goes against the old view that Mark condensed Matthew simply because it's shorter. I think St. Augustine believed that, but that's pretty obviously wrong, since if you compare them side by side as you're doing, you see that where they overlap, Matthew is shorter, not Mark. There's just a whole lot more of Matthew besides it. Let's see. Last example is addressing how Jesus gains a big following in Galilee. In Matthew, we have Jesus teaching and preaching in synagogue and healing people, while in Mark, Jesus has the Spirit showdown in the synagogue. Yeah, that is interesting, because in Mark, what convinces the people that they ought to pay attention to this guy is that he is able to exorcise and silence some lunatic sitting in the pews. And I know who you are, Jesus. You're the Holy One of God. Will you shut up and get out of here? Jesus says to him. And then the people are amazed. They say, wow, what teaching with authority, implying by means of exorcism, exousia, appeal to an authority to kick out a demon. But in Matthew, though he doesn't mind having exorcism stories, he has the crowd react to the teaching of Jesus, such as the Sermon on the Mount. So it's a bit of a difference. There's no real substantial disagreement, but the way Matthew has changed it fits the fact that he has organized his gospel to create a Jesus Pentateuch, to make Jesus the new Moses. He's got these 5 huge blocks of teaching, and I believe it's after the sermon that people are amazed. So it's not what he does, but what he says there. Let's see. Let's see here. Also in Mark, the way the Spirit addresses Jesus in the synagogue, and again, that's let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Are you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. It seems very similar to the spirit inside the pigs in Matthew 8:29. Yeah, that makes sense. In fact, both of them are talking about the plural. That in the second case, the Gadarene or Gerasene demoniac, there are supposed to be thousands of demons in the poor guy, legion, right? And in an adequate interpretation. You can't read in more than that this demon is speaking for himself and his colleagues. We all know who you are, which is why Mark says he kept silencing the demons he cast out because they knew who he was. So there's this like demon Facebook where they're sharing all of this information, but it comes to the same thing that Jesus has the demons on the run as the kingdom of God advances in his wake. Pretty neat. Let's see. Lastly, I wanted to say I'm trying to be a better critic. Any tips on how to approach the text so I can refine my hypothesis? Well, you're certainly doing the right thing by comparing one version of a gospel with another, and the easiest way to do that, and this is what got Bart Ehrman to dump fundamentalism. He just looked at a synopsis of the Gospels, one of these things where they have Mark in the middle column and then Matthew and Luke on either side. So you can see the differences in how apparently Matthew and Luke have each changed Mark. That right away tells you I'm not simply reading transcripts. And then you can start looking at the patterns for how they change Mark and how they change Q, which of course we don't have a copy of, but you can kind of distill it from Matthew and Luke by looking at where they differ as to how they treat the material they have in common with each other, but not with Mark. You can kind of tell what Q must have read like, knowing the pattern of changes that they made to Mark. If the stuff that isn't in Mark, but that they share, has the same sort of differences, then you can infer the same sort of changes and infer in turn what Q must have said. And that's been done. There are various reconstructions of Q by Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, James M. Robinson, and several others. And they're not Burt and Mack. They're not that different. It's not that subjective. So that I think is important. Also to compare similar stories even within the same gospel as you've just done here, right? Why are the demons speaking in plural, first person plural in the different stories? Does it mean the same thing? What's going on? That's very important. In fact, one of the most important things I have noticed over the many years I've studied this stuff is if you can get it firmly in your mind well enough, you can eventually start saying, I think I've heard something like this argument or this story or this line somewhere else in the Bible. Oh, yeah, there's something like that over here in 1 Corinthians. I wonder what the relationship is. And that sort of thinking led my colleague, David Oliver Smith, to write his book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, where he says, gee, it looks to me like the Gospels are using the Pauline epistles, and fascinating. And so that's what I would say. Look for similarities and analogies and ask, is there dependence? If it is there evidence to say that one borrowed from the other? And if not, what does it mean? Does this mean that this sentiment is common in early Christianity, etc.? I would think those would be good habits of mind, and I'm glad you're pursuing that, Derek. Nice going. John Brockman says, so if we discard a historical Jesus, we also get to discard the apostles, right? If they're all fiction and the whole thing is supposed to be super mystical and whatnot, then would the 12 apostles represent astrological things, or the 12 tribes of Israel, or was it just a lucky number? Well, it is certainly possible that there is an astrological basis to this. That has long been suggested. Count Volney, I think, was one of the first modern mythicists, and he said, the whole thing looks to me like solar mythology. And of course, my beloved friend and colleague, Acharya S., and if you can give to her medical fund, please do, on truthbeknown.com and elsewhere. She's battling cancer, and if you can help her out with donations there, that would be great. Well, she's just explored the astrological basis of the Christ myth and all that in great detail, very illuminating. And yeah, that view says just like the 12 labors of Hercules represent the houses of the sun and the houses of the zodiac, so does Jesus traveling with the 12 disciples. He is the sun, as you see on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they are the houses of the zodiac. Must have been more to it, but we at least have that vestige. That makes a lot of sense. Of course, you can't get into a time machine and go back and find out definitively, but that's the way it is with ancient history and religion. It's possible that this is just a sort of fictive reading back into the time of Jesus of a 12-man hierarchy, such as we find at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls community. And again, it is, and that is kind of compatible with a theory that I've entertained for a good while, that the apostles and their names, and in fact, I think Margaret Morrison has explored this a bit, that these guys were early Christian leaders who were put back into the supposed time of Jesus to increase their clout, and that there was a Clement, there may have been a Peter and all that, but they weren't actually associates of the possibly mythical Jesus. That would be very interesting if it were true, because that would make the apostles like the ascended masters of Madame Blavatsky in theosophy. She talked about Moria El and Kut Humi and these various other ones that she said were ancient adepts and Buddhas and so on, who were still around in spirit form and giving her revelations. Well, non-theosophists thought she's just making it up. She was kind of a hoaxer, but somebody, I forget the name of the scholar, did a lot of research and found out, no, these people actually did exist, but they weren't what she said they were. They were just acquaintances of hers that she built into the mythology. Fascinating. Could be the same with the apostles. But the theory I most favor is that of Robert Eisenman, that the 12 are kind of doublets, multiplications of four original characters who were considered to be the pillars or the heirs of Jesus, who would have been James the Just, James son of Alphaeus, James son of Zebedee, etc., and even Nathaniel, who was a true Israelite under the fig tree, and so on, Jacob. And there was Judas, who was Judas Thomas, Judas Iscariot, Judas not Iscariot, Judas the Zealot, and so forth. There was Simeon, who became Simeon Bar Cleophas, Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, etc., etc. And there was we got left Joses, who I think is a scribal error, that was supposed to be the earthly father of Jesus, and originally the line in Margaret, is this not the son of Mary and Joses, and that the original fourth name was John, which became John, son of Zebedee, John the Baptist, his so-called cousin, and so forth. Thomas became, Judas Thomas also became Thaddeus, and Addai, and so forth. So I think that makes an awful lot of sense, that the 12 are really just multiplied by mitosis from these earlier 4 enigmatic characters. Okay. Another one from John. If God is supposed to be eternal and unchanging and outside of time, how do apologists square the circle and give him a changing, mortal, human nature that exists inside of time? Yeah, that is a big question. I think Kierkegaard dealt with it under the phrase the infinite qualitative distinction. And you could push it farther than he did, or let's say in a different direction, and say, what could it even mean? In fact, I deal with this in one of the chapters of The Case Against the Case for Christ. What are you even saying if you say this infinite, eternal, absolute entity has become a human being? I mean, isn't that like saying you're making water into fire? I mean, they're completely opposite, aren't they? Like, think of what the Eastern theologians say, that you can't grasp God, you can't describe God. All you can do is to get a little less confused by eliminating erroneous, idolatrous ideas of God. What do you got left? Well, you still don't know what God is like, but at least you're not stuck on inadequate views anymore. Well, I don't know if that's that makes sense to me, but I don't know if you can go from that to a belief in the incarnation. And I think that Philo and the Gospel of John are trying to bridge that gap with the old Stoic idea of the Logos, but I'm not sure it works. The Logos is a kind of an image of God, externalized from the eternal into the finite, but where's the continuity? Where's the graft point? I'm not sure if that really works. The timelessness, the infinity, like God, if God is eternal and doesn't experience time, how can you even say God does anything or did anything? Did he go from being potentially a creator one day to actually being a creator the next one? That implies, as Aristotle would say, God moving from potentiality to actuality, whereas divine perfection is pure act, pure fulfillment. How could God change by going from one place to another? He's already in all of them. How could God, has Spinoza also said, how could God have a series of connected thoughts? He knows everything all the time, and so forth. And that just destroys and renders totally mythological any idea of God as a person acting, speaking, thinking, feeling. And this, I think, was seen well by Pascal, who said the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the philosophers. And it's just an unbridgeable gap, in my humble opinion. So, yeah, and the apologists do try to paper over the difference. You can say God set aside his prerogatives, a la Philippians chapter 2, for the sake of the incarnation. But again, what do you got left? I mean, how is the one the other? I don't see it. A fascinating attempt to deal with this was Raymond Panikkar, P-A-N-I-K-K-A-R, great Indian theologian, who dealt with this in his book, The Unknown Christ of Hinduism, where he tried to understand the relationship between Jesus and the Godhead as analogous to Ishvara, the personified Lord, and Brahman, the Nirguna Brahman without qualities. But that, I think, really just repeats the problem more than solving it. Though it's been a long time since I've read it, it's certainly well worth a read. The Unknown Christ of Hinduism by Raymond Panikkar. Panikkar. Okay, who's next here? This is, Dave Hill. Back to the top. What is the best order to read the Old Testament books to get an understanding of the history of Israel it's trying to propose? It's been many years since I've read through it, and I vaguely remember the book of Kings and Chronicles are very similar, but from different perspectives. So, for example, should they be read in parallel? Ideally, yes, definitely. It's like reading Mark and comparing him with Matthew and Luke. Should I read some of the Psalms that relate to various histories covered in different books? I don't think that would really help, because all that stuff at the beginning of the Psalms, this was when David was doing some carpentry on his basement. Those are just ancient scribal guesswork. There's really no historical information in them. And I no longer can suggest what is the way to go, because the minimalist revolution has thrown everything up in the air. It's difficult to know what was written when, what was responding to what else. You might as well just read them in the order in which they appear in the book, and then be on the lookout for differences and changes. Maybe the best book is still Julius Wellhausen, Wellausen, Prolegomena to the History of Israel in hardback. The more easily obtainable paperback lacks the word ancient. So it's Prolegomena to the History of Israel. It's the paperback that adds the ancient. There are other ways. I mean, a lot of people would challenge the order, but what that he presupposes, like the prophets before the law and all that, but still he makes an awful lot of sense. And of course, ideally, you have to start looking at various theories, but Wellhausen would be a great place to start. There is just a huge amount to learn from that wonderful book. My second question involves the blind Bartimaeus story in Mark. Then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, that's what Bartimaeus means, was sitting by the road. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up, he's calling for you." Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus, and answering him, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. What happened in Jericho between arriving and leaving? Why are many sternly telling him to be quiet? Is it because he's calling Jesus the son of David? Is it important that Jesus has the disciples call him to Jesus? Why the detail of throwing aside his cloak? I've heard theories, possibly by you as well as others, that the name is a play on Plato's work Timaeus, and that Bartimaeus regains his sight when he throws away his philosopher's cloak, abandons Platonism, and follows Jesus. This explanation was strengthened for me while reading Judith Liu's, I think that's right, Lieu, new book on Marcion and the Making of a Heretic, God and Scripture in the 2nd Century. On page 342, she writes, "For many, the most troubling aspect is the question of human responsibility." What? For many, the most troubling aspect of the question of human responsibility was that of the origin of their capacity for the wrong choices. Again, Plato's Timaeus offered a multi-layered myth whose primary goal was to ensure that the demiurge would be, quote, guiltless of any future evil in any of them, end quote. Plato, Timaeus, 41d through 44d, especially 42d. In Hellenistic Judaism, both wisdom literature and apocalyptic sought solutions that would also distance the Creator from responsibility for human as well as for angelic evil, and such ideas, particularly of heavenly rebellion, were readily adopted by the early Christians. Could this be a healing parable in the Marcionite vein, where true sight is only to be found in Jesus and not in philosophy supporting the demiurge? Well, yeah, it could be, but even if this is correct, you really don't need to look farther than Colossians, where it says, don't give heed to philosophy of men. But it could be that. I mean, it is a little hard to overlook Timaeus, though. J. Duncan M. Derritt, may he rest in peace, what a living encyclopedia we sorely miss. Derritt said that he thinks that we're overlooking another derivation of the name that in Aramaic, temya, means beggar. And so he is the son of the beggar, which kind of puts me in mind of an old song from the Soupy Sales show, where Pookie the Lion would sing, give me that old unemployment, give me that old unemployment, give me that old unemployment, it's good enough for me, it was good for my father, etc., etc. But anyhow, yeah, that would make sense, that he's just one of Tsvetan Todorov's narrative men, that he's named for his function in the story and he's not a genuine character. The throwing off of the cloak may simply be intended to show how eager the guy was. And I've read that possibility, and that kind of makes sense. It's sort of analogous to in the same gospel where they're in the Garden of Gethsemane and the Roman troops are about, or whoever they are trying to grab the young man in the Lenin Sindon, and they just miss him he escapes by the skin of his teeth, leaving his garment behind, right? There may not be any real esoteric sense. It may just be vividness in the narrative. Sorry about that. I had to sneeze out a demon. But it really is an embarrassment of riches, the different possibilities here. Again, it's been suggested that the Son of David thing is theological, and that his blindness consists in his believing that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. And that's also why people tell him to shut up about it. Of course, you could read that as analogous to Jesus shutting up the demons because they knew who he was, right? In this case, the author would be, the evangelist would have the crowd tell Bartimaeus to keep quiet because Mark knows he's got the wrong idea. Keep in mind, a few chapters later, Jesus is shown denying the Davidic descent of the Messiah. How could he be his son? Look at Psalm 110. David, who they thought wrote the psalm, says, the Lord, Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put your enemies under your feet. And he says, well, David would never refer to him as his son, and no matter who he was. And I'm sorry, he would never refer to his son as his Lord, no matter who he was. So he obviously isn't talking about his son. My Lord is the Messiah. Contemporary interpreters are right about that, but he's not Davidic. Well, if Mark could write that, he could have Bartimaeus stand in for those Christians that thought Jesus was Davidic. Who knows, though? I mean, any of those things would make some sense. They're all pretty clever. Maybe we're all just reading in all kinds of stuff to a miracle story. I'm not suggesting that that's all it is. I am certainly interested in subtleties of possible meaning. I don't think any of those interpretations are being over subtle. Don't let me give you that idea. My third question will probably result only in a could be answer from you. I was watching a show the other day about John Allegro and the copper scroll from Qumran. He used the locations from the scroll for several archaeological digs in the hope of finding treasure described in the scroll. While he did find the locations, in each case, thieves had already made off with the loot. Given that some scholars posit that Jesus was part of the Qumran community, do you think Matthew 6:19 through 21 could be in response to his own sectarians? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Well, I don't know. I wouldn't really connect them because it's always a danger that if you have riches, people are going to try to steal them. Right, that comes up elsewhere in the Gospels. You know, if the homeowner had known when the burglar was coming in, he'd have waited up for him and stopped him, and so on. I mean, that's going to happen all the time. So you're going to have literal and metaphorical references to it. So I would say Allegro's unsuccessful attempt, rather like Geraldo Rivera and the vault of Al Capone, just reflect, it's the same sort of thing that Egyptian archaeologists find, that when they find ancient tombs, they're already despoiled. That's why the King Tut tomb was such an amazing find. Somehow the jackals hadn't gotten to it, but usually they do. And I think that's what happened there. Some people have theorized that the Copper Scroll, which was simply a list of where the treasure was buried, perhaps the treasure of the Jerusalem temple, is Norman Gold. What is it? Just Norman Gold? Or am I missing part of his name? Oh boy. As he suggested, that it was, they were getting it away from the Romans. Some have said that no, it was some kind of allegorical thing, which makes no sense to me. I have to assume that that like there were other copies of this and other people knew, or maybe some of the Qumran sectarians who survived knew where it was and decided they needed the money. My final question involves Margaret Barker. She believes the early Christians were inheritors of a first temple remnant of Hebrews in opposition to Second Temple Jews. These sectarians were anti-Mosaic law, and she identifies them with Qumran and the Johannine community in particular, with Marcion and or his predecessors being on the scene quite early and being anti-Mosaic law as well. Where do you think the Marcionites would fit into her Christian reconstruction? Could this imply Paul was also of this first temple group and his Judaizing opponents were Second Temple Jewish Christian adherents? Yeah, it could. My big qualm there is I don't think there was a first temple, or if you want to put it this way, the first temple was that of Zerubbabel. There had been no temple of Solomon. In fact, that was an attempt to gain a more ancient pedigree for the rather humble temple of Zerubbabel. Yes, I know he sounds like a character from the Flintstones. And it was just like Wellhausen and others pointed out that the tabernacle was an attempt to push the temple's pedigree back into the time of Moses. There had never been a tabernacle. In the same way, I think there had never been a Solomon's temple. There certainly is no archaeological record of it. And so there I'd have a problem, but I put that whole thing, that big change, as I've said earlier today, the Deuteronomic reform, much, much later. But still, I think she's got the thing right in terms of the continuing adherence to an older form of Judaism as opposed to the revised version that the priests were trying to push. The Zadokite priests who split over stuff like this and formed the Qumran community. And I favor Robert Eisenman's theory that Paul was the spouter of lies, the mocker, as he's called in the scrolls, who repudiated the covenant in the community. I believe those words are used in the scrolls, and that's Paul. And that the same story is told about how Simon Magus broke with the John the Baptist community because Simon was Paul. That is a connection I don't believe Eisenman makes, but I think it fits in very well. So basically, I think Margaret Barker is right. I just have, I would put the thing in a slightly different framework. From Phil the Thrill. When Jesus mentions Abraham's bosom in the story of Lazarus and the rich man, what is he or his author referring to? Was that a piece of 1st or 2nd century Jewish theology? Am I correct that this phrase and concept only explicitly appears in that one parable? It seems like a big departure from the Sheol concept that I thought most Jewish scholars of the day believed in. Well, in the book of Enoch, there are various compartments of the afterworld. There's the places like Tartarus where the fallen angels are imprisoned, but there's also the place where the saints of the past are kept, and it's rather complicated already there, which sort of makes me think that you had an attempt by somebody to harmonize the various ideas of the afterlife held by Jews, though it didn't succeed in ironing it all out. There were various views of immortality in the afterlife for a long time in Judaism. We don't have, as far as I know, the Abraham's bosom reference anywhere else attested. I doubt if Luke made it up, but it seems to have been one of many views. But there is something like it in the Testament of Abraham, if I'm not mistaken, where Abraham sees he doesn't want to die. It's his time, and the angel of death comes and finally has to trick him into giving up and going, which reminds me of a Twilight Zone episode or two. And he sees that that souls going to heaven have to pass the patriarch Abel, who is a kind of Osiris-like judge and welcoming committee. And I think that is very similar. It's like another version of the idea of a kind of a deified patriarch Abraham there. And of course, the Abraham's bosom, it to me, that implies Abraham's welcome. Right, he's embracing those who appear there after their death, and not that he's necessarily going to stay there, but the rich man sees him being embraced by Abraham as he arrives. That's what I think it means. But the closest parallel I know is that thing from the the Testament of Abraham. Yeah, so it's a messy situation, that's for sure. Let's see. Okay, from M.D. Simpson. Back up to the top. Oh, Venerable Geek. Before my real question, I have a rather long comment and an accompanying smaller question. Recently, when I I welcome stuff like that. So recently, when you appeared on Aaron Ra's podcast, the subject of abortion in the Bible came up. You said that nowhere in the canon is the issue addressed, and pointed out that Aaron Ra's supposed examples are not really all that relevant to modern concerns, or sometimes not even clear in their intended meaning. I quite agree. However, sparked partly by your discussion there, I was on a search for any and all passages that could conceivably relate to the topic, even obliquely, when I stumbled upon what is apparently an explicit reference to abortion in more or less modern terms in a canonical book of the Bible. It is offered as the only such reference to be found therein by Richard Elliott Friedman and Shauna Delansky in their book, The Bible Now. Their literal translation of the Masoretic text of Jeremiah 20:14 through 18 follows. Cursed be the... Wait a minute. Are you sure? Sure. Yeah, okay, I guess it's Jeremiah. It sounds kind of like Job. Cursed be the day in which I was born, the day that my mother bore me. Let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who informed my father, saying, a male child's been born to you, making him glad. And let that man be like the cities Yahweh overturned and didn't regret. And let him hear crying in the morning and wailing at noontime, because he didn't kill me from the womb, and my mother would be my tomb, and her womb an eternal pregnancy. Why is this that I came out of the womb, to see suffering and agony, and my days consumed in shame? Apart from the obvious and obviously disturbing contextual meaning, Friedman and Delansky explain that the phrase from the womb does indeed mean in the womb. The RSV translates it as such, the New American Standard Bible, before birth. Needless to say, this discovery was surprising. The authors note that it is in keeping with the difficulty of finding relevant prescriptive references to abortion that this sole mention occurs in a heavily rhetorical section of poetry. Additionally, it evidently doesn't envision Jeremiah's mother having any voice in the matter, but at any rate, it seems that at least one biblical writer at one time in one circumstance had something to say about the issue. My question then, had you encountered this before, and do you count it as a reference to essentially the modern concept of abortion, even if it doesn't approach it from any kind of moral angle? Nope. Why isn't this talking about miscarriage, the baby dying in the womb? I don't think there's any hint here of abortion, of intervention to end the life of the fetus. Okay, and now the main question. How about Polycarp and Luke? Doesn't the two-source hypothesis presuppose or imply Matthew's and Luke's respective ignorance of one another, since they differ most significantly in the narrative material not taken from Mark? Yeah, I think so. If this is the case, doesn't this clash with the hypothesis I think you hold to of Polycarp as both the ecclesiastical redactor, or more to the point, expander of Ur-Lukas or Marcion's Luke, and the compiler of a New Testament canon, as he would then have to be well aware of Matthew? Or, while this is clear in my head, let me risk jumping the gun. As I understand it, there already was this Ur-Lukas that shared Q with Matthew, and most of the Polycarp addition to create canonical Luke was redaction of Luke, not of Matthew, not of the parallel passages. Except in a case like the temptation narrative. That's always posed a problem for the two-source hypothesis, because Q would otherwise be pretty much just a sayings collection like the Gospel of Thomas, but lo and behold, here is this rather involved story. Well, in my opinion, the Ur-Lukas did not have this Matthew created it based on Deuteronomy, where God takes Moses up to a mountain and shows him the kingdoms of the Canaanite seaboard that Israel is going to conquer. And then he's going to die shortly thereafter. Because what happens, this is in Deuteronomy, and what happens then in Deuteronomy, in Matthew, Jesus goes into the wilderness to be tested by the devil. He's shown the kingdoms, and in every case, Jesus beats Satan or passes the test, whatever, by quoting passages from Deuteronomy, where Israel had failed the test, but Jesus passes it. So I think that whole complex is a Matthean rewrite of Deuteronomy, parts of Deuteronomy, and that Luke simply didn't have it, but that Polycarp, who did know Matthew, has added it to Luke with a bit of a change in the order and so on. I am not sure if let's see now, what else would fit that? My guess is that the resurrection narratives already differed, and Polycarp simply did not change those. And I'd have to think more about more examples, but I think that, yeah, a whole lot of Luke, most of it was pre-Polycarp, and it seems to me what Polycarp would have added doesn't clash with Matthew, but that might explain. I'd have to look at the individual instances. That might help us explain the occasional Matthew-Luke agreements against Mark. That could be corrections, so to speak, by Polycarp, who wanted to harmonize, as scribes generally did. Okay, or does the theory, this is back to our questioner, or does the theory suppose that the Luke Polycarp redacted already had the material that distinguishes it from Matthew? For instance, the birth narrative, the resurrection appearances. Yeah, I was jumping the gun, sorry. And therefore makes it easier to picture Polycarp, the editor, unconsciously or semi-consciously harmonizing the two the way modern believers do, than it would be to picture Polycarp the redactor not simply following Matthew's version if he were adding that non-Mark and non-Q material on his own. Yeah, that is what I think happened. Or would your idea be that Polycarp expanded Ur-Lukas / Gospel of Marcion in initial ignorance of Matthew, then a good many years later, after having become aware of Matthew, he compiled the canon? I suppose this presents its own problems. Would Polycarp, who he assures Theophilus had traced all things accurately from their source, be so ecumenical as to put his massive, comprehensive gospel not just alongside, but third in the running of 3 other gospels? Well, that's not that important, I think. Because I believe by putting Matthew first, he was able to put in as a keynote what Jesus says near the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which itself is near the beginning of Matthew, where he would have added to the Q passage, "It is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for a jot or tittle of the Torah to pass." Now, Luke 16 has that as well. But I think Polycarp has added the surrounding material in Matthew 5:17 through 19. Do not think I came to abolish the law and the prophets. I came not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And then you have the original Q verse. And after that, therefore, anyone who relaxes or breaks, whatever translation you prefer, the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, while whoever keeps even the least of these commandments and teaches others likewise shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. That, I think, is Polycarp aiming right at Marcion, because Marcion is the one who says, yeah, Jesus came to abolish the law and the prophets, so don't bother with them anymore. So I think he did add that. Let's see. Okay, to get to the point, what does Herr Trobisch's theory mean for the two-source hypothesis, or have I missed something altogether? Your most holy pronouncements are anxiously awaited and is always appreciated more than you can know. Well, yeah, I think that it doesn't involve any kind of wholesale change. In fact, I deal with that in the pre-Nicene New Testament and its little brother, the Human Bible New Testament, when I say that there are scholars generally notice there are about 5 or 6 places where something that appeared in Mark does not appear in Luke, but does appear in Acts. And I put them back in Ur-Lukas on the assumption that Polycarp, who wrote Acts, decided to make the change, that the Ur-Lukas did have that material. So there are some things I think can be pegged as redactions of one gospel, of the Gospels by Polycarp that don't get into the muddy waters of the two-source hypothesis. Let's see, this is pretty wild. And with this, I think I'll stop. What is this? Longer than I thought. This is from Vesna. Yeah, might as well bite off a big piece and see if I can chew it adequately. I wonder if you could comment on a strange parable I used to hear while growing up in Baltimore. You're lucky you got out of there alive. My family regularly attended a Greek Orthodox church as the nearest Serbian church was too far a drive. The Greek church held an abbreviated version of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom for youth in the gym before sending us to our Sunday school classrooms. The parable of the wedding banquet, told in Matthew 22, 1 through 14, was part of the repertoire of Bible readings. It seems this parable isn't widely known because no one I've asked has heard it before. I did hear it discussed on an atheist podcast, but the host said they were reading it for the first time. Maybe I heard it more because it's an Eastern Orthodox favorite, or maybe the priest of that church just happened to like it. It's a peculiar story to tell children, but then so are many other better-known Bible tales. After my Sunday school days, I didn't hear the parable mentioned again until 2013 at one of my last visits to the Unitarian Universalist congregation where I belonged for several years. The minister read it aloud and then explained what the story illustrated, according to her. I was struck by 2 things. First, how weird and far-fetched the parable is, and second, how weird and far-fetched the minister's interpretation was. In fact, it was part of why I finally quit the group. I went home meaning to write and ask you for your thoughts about the parable, and here I finally am. The kingdom of God, says Jesus, is like a king who is having a big wedding for his son. The king sends out invitations, but the people on the guest list don't want to come. They make excuses about how busy they are. Some even treat shamefully the servants who bring the invites. They even murder them. The king sends his armies to kill the violent would-be guests. The king's armies burn down their whole city. The king decides to invite a completely different set of people. He sends servants to the partings of the highways, forks in the road, to round up whomever they might encounter, bad and good, it says, and bring them to the wedding. A great time is had by all. Here it feels like the story is over. It's already bizarre because, well, why didn't those people want to go to the fabulous shindig? What sort of death wish inspired them to kill servants sent by the king? But at least it seems to have a happy ending. Regular folks get to enjoy a wonderful occasion that highfalutin murderers turned up their noses at. But it's not over. Now the story gets even weirder and darker. The king notices that one of the guests isn't wearing a wedding garment. And in response, the king addresses the fellow as friend, and demands to know how he got in without a wedding garment on, and calls for the guards to tie him up and cast him into the outer darkness. He curses the improperly dressed guest with weeping and gnashing of teeth. Throw him out into the outer darkness where there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The parable ends abruptly here. Jesus reveals the moral: from many are called, but few are chosen. The you-yous around me gasp throughout this story as the horrors unfolded. When the cryptic punchline came, a few people let out a brief and uncomfortable laugh. The room was still for a moment. If we were in a cartoon, you'd have seen dozens of question marks hanging in the air over people's heads. All were waiting, it seemed, to learn what it meant. Why would the king address a man as friend just as a prelude to condemning him? Why was wearing the wrong thing a capital offense? Because the guests were rounded up in the course of their travels. How could they be expected to happen to have wedding garments at the ready? Into this charged atmosphere, the minister cast her interpretation. She told us that once upon a time, when she was running a weekend conference at a campground, a transgender person asked for the use of a neutral bathroom. The person didn't feel comfortable using either a shared bathroom or men's or women's. The minister denied the request. She told the trans person to simply pick a bathroom and basically deal with it. On reading the parable of the wedding banquet, the minister realized that the trans person was like the guest who wasn't dressed as expected for a wedding. The minister, for her part, had behaved just like the king. She had failed to create an environment where the trans person felt safe and comfortable. The minister had ungraciously cast the trans person into the darkness of alienation and suffering. The point of the parable, the minister concluded, is this: we all need to reach deep within to learn how to be more welcoming. Everyone I spoke to afterward was confused both about the parable and the minister's spin on it. The king in the story was clearly presented as the good guy. It was the bad guests who were being taught a lesson. Plus, it was a stretch to compare the minister's insensitivity to the king's murderous tantrums. I thought the symbolism was obvious, and it had nothing to do with being a bad host. Here's my interpretation. The king is supposed to be God. Jesus is the son, the bridegroom, as elsewhere in the Gospels. The first group of guests invited were supposed to be God's original chosen people, the Jews. They blew off their invitation. Some even harassed and killed the people spreading the word. God punished them, the destruction of the temple and associated mayhem, and uninvited them. He unfriended them, you might say. He summoned everybody else. The parting of the highways equals the cosmopolitan Hellenistic world, to Christianity instead. Now anyone can join up, good or bad, hooray! But Christianity has a code of behavior, and woe to those who try to get the rewards of Christianity without following the code. That's like going to a wedding without the proper garment. You mean like my friend Chuck Hoffman did when he went to what he considered an ill-advised wedding back in the 80s, I guess. He knew this was disastrous, and he was right, as it turned out. He wore an orange leisure suit over a Star Wars t-shirt. Well, I guess, he'd have been thrown out there in the outer darkness. What can you tell us about this odd parable? Does my interpretation seem plausible? How does this parable fit into Matthew as a whole? Do you think the coda about the fellow without the right outfit could have been added on later, as it does feel like it comes after the story is already over? Can you point me to further commentary on the topic? In short, what saith the geek? Well, I think you're exactly right in every detail. And the book I would recommend is the monumental book by Joachim Jeremias called The Parables of Jesus. It is a classic of form criticism. And Joachim, Joachim, and Jeremias is Jeremias, basically Jeremias, The Parables of Jesus. What he says is, and I think this is right, Matthew has combined two parables. One was a short parable that has the beginning of it. A king announces a wedding feast for his son. And then it went immediately to the arrival of the guests, who all were forewarned of the nature of the occasion and did have wedding garments. But this one guy showed up without them, even though he should have known better. And so they kick him out. And what is this about? As Jeremias points out, it was a well-known rabbinic metaphor to speak of the white garment to be provided at the eschatological banquet, as implying the righteousness of those who attain to the resurrection, and the robe is the resurrection body. Okay, that was one parable, and it's very much like what one of the great rabbis, I forget which one, said, you don't know when you're going to be summoned to the banquet, so you better be ready at any given moment. Be righteous, be wearing the right garment, so to speak. Surely that's the point. Now, Matthew has added that on to the Great Supper parable from Q, which Luke also has in something much closer to the original form, as does the Gospel of Thomas. In that version, the host is not a king, and it's not a wedding feast for his son. It's just a big feast. I'll get to where that comes from in a minute. But he gives them advanced warning. So they know the date, but perhaps they don't know the hour because, there's a lot of food to prepare and all that. So he sends out his messenger saying, well, this is it. We're going to be eating in about an hour. So come on. It shouldn't take them by surprise, but it saves them the problem of having to wait around forever, right? I think that all is very plausible in terms of the narrative. But when the messengers go and say, okay, it's time, they say, look, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to cancel out. You see, so-and-so has come up, and you understand. Make my excuses for me, right? Okay. And once the messengers get back, the host is furious. He says, what? None of them are going to come? Well, okay, none of them are ever going to eat from my table again. Tell you what, I don't want the food to go to waste. Go out and bring in anybody you find and invite them. And so they do, and they're happy enough to come in. Well, in the Q and Luke version, the point is that the offer of the kingdom has been made to the rightful heirs to it, Jews, but they haven't bought it. And they're not responding to the Christian preaching, or Jeremias figured to the preaching of Jesus. And so as a result, God has said, okay, they had their chance. Now I'm going to the Gentiles. Paul says the same thing 3 times in the book of Acts. Well, you didn't see fit to respond, so from now on I'm going to the Gentiles. Of course, he doesn't, because he's talking to unreceptive Jews again and says the same thing, right? But that's no problem. He's just trying to reiterate the theology of it. To the Jew first, but then to the Greek. And okay. So that's what it's about in Q and Luke. And it seems to me it's very obviously a post-Jesus parable, even if you think there was a historical Jesus. Matthew has redacted it in a clumsy way. He's combined it with details from the parable of the vineyard and the wicked sharecroppers. Right, because that also has the notion of God sending messengers. The absentee landlord sends his representatives to get his cut of the yield of the crop at harvest time, and these guys don't want to give it to him and beat up and abuse the messengers. And finally, the king says, "Well, surely they'll respect my son." And so he sends him, but they kill him, and because they figure, look, if it's his son, it must be because the old man is dead and he's seeing to the accounts now. If we kill him, we take over the vineyard as by squatters' rights. But of course, he's wrong. The king is still alive. They kill the son, and then they get it. He finally exercises his authority and, I guess, kills them all, whatever it is. Matthew has taken this, not just the cold shoulder, not just the excuses offered the messengers, but the abuse and murder of them, which sort of made sense in the wicked sharecroppers things, the wicked tenants, whatever you want to call it, but makes no sense in this case, except I guess you could say, he's a king in Matthew, so he can do whatever the heck he wants. But it still doesn't work because he sends out his troops to kill all of these guys and destroy their cities. And then he says, okay, now let's get back to the supper. What, the food is still hot on the table after a military campaign? What the heck? He just hasn't thought it out. And then he brackets it with the beginning and end of this short parable of the guest without a wedding garment. Now, where did the whole thing come from? Apparently from an old Jewish parable that we find in the Mishnah, where it's trying to explain why the wicked seem to have the better of it. Okay, there's this guy, Bartimaeus, who is a well-known, wealthy tax collector. That is, he works for the Romans and takes a commission on all the money he gets, which prompts him to exact more from the people than Rome is requiring. He keeps whatever he can get out of them beyond that. So he's wealthy. But he knows tax collectors are not highly esteemed for the reasons I just told you. So he's trying to be a social climber and gain respect among the wealthy who are more righteous. So he announces this huge feast and sends messengers to them when the time is right for the feast. And they won't come because they realize they're being had and they don't want to cooperate with this. They don't want to give the guy respectability. He doesn't deserve it. This whole thing is manipulation. So he then says, oh boy, it didn't work. Well, I don't want the food to go to waste. Just bring in anybody you find, the poor and the street bums and all that. What's the point of this version of the story? Well, he dies shortly thereafter, and there is a huge funeral procession that everybody attends. But the same day, I think it's Rabbi Bun Bar Hajjah, I think that's it. He dies. He's a young man, a great student of the Torah. He dies. Nobody takes any notice. And so this one guy, a fellow scholar, says to their mentor, explain this to me, Rabbi. You mean the scholar of the Torah dies? Nobody gives a damn. But this hypocritical tax collector dies and everybody's out in mourning. Where's the justice in this? And he said, well, here's what happened. Bartimaeus had done one virtuous thing in his whole stinking life, and that was to invite the poor to this banquet, which wasn't intended for him, but it was good that at least he fed him with the meal. And because of that one good thing, this was his reward, and I might add his only reward. He got this acclamation when he died. Of course, he's in hell now. And you can see some rubbing off on Lazarus and the rich man. But the young rabbi, he's up in heaven with God. Who cares about the funeral? And so again, Lazarus and the rich man influence. And surely that is the original version. It's kind of divided off and it's broken apart and traveled through the stream of oral tradition as both the parable of the rich man and Lazarus and the parable of the Great Supper, and it explains elements in the latter that wouldn't make sense without it. Why do they pass up the invite with plainly contrived excuses? Well, the rabbinic version explains that. They're boycotting it on purpose because they know they're being manipulated and they're not going to do it. Yeah, I love that stuff. Thanks for opening Pandora's box, Vesna. Well, that's it for today's Bible Geekery. I'll be getting back to you again pretty soon. But I got to admit, I'm still burying my head in the Holy Fable book. And once again, let me just shamelessly mention, I'm going to try to open up a Patreon account pretty soon, but it's more complicated than you might think, especially for a dullard like me. If you can send any contributions our way to Che Price, our creditors would sure appreciate it. I got to put it that way because that's what the issue is. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be bothering you. Anyway, thanks for joining me once again for another exciting episode of The Bible Geek.